Go ahead, Audrey. We're actually, sorry, one moment. Actually, we're going to do a very quick intro.
Yeah.
And then you're welcome to start.
Great.
Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome Audrey, our speaker today. Audrey is a doctoral researcher at Imperial College London, and her research covers environmental policy and biodiversity and climate governance with a specific focus on Amazonian countries. Before beginning her PhD, Audrey was program coordinator of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford University, and today she's going to be talking about nature-based.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, can people already see my slides? Because I am already sharing them. Yeah. Perfect. I think that's good. So it's wonderful to be with everyone today, albeit virtually. So as was said, I'm going to talk to you today about international biodiversity policy, about climate biodiversity synergies, and about nature-based solutions. Thanks for that great intro. Here it is again. So I'm a current PhD researcher, and I'm also coordinator of the UNCB, the Academia and Research Organizations Group. But before I was at Oxford for 5 years, working with the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative and doing my MSc at Oxford. And before that, I was based at McGill back in Canada, where I'm from. So today I'm going to talk to you about my talk is 4 different parts. So first of all, about kind of climate change and biodiversity loss, these twin crises. Next, I'll go into more the policy side of things, so talking about international biodiversity policy and the global biodiversity framework. And then I'll have a short break for questions before going into the part about nature-based solutions. And then just at the very, very end, I have a brief slide or two about IPBES 12. So, and in terms of questions, I won't be able to see or to really see the chat and the Q&A as I go along. So as I said, there'll be questions, time for questions in the middle and at the end. And I think the moderators, the organizers will be kind of moderating some of the questions as well. And there'll be a Menti poll at some point near the beginning as well. So many of you may have already seen these types of figures over here. The figure that is released annually, this one was actually from last year, 2025, by the World Economic Forum, and these are the global risks ranked by severity over the short term, over the long term. And what we see year after year is that the long-term risks are very much dominated by environmental risks. So we can see 5 out of the 10 here are dominated by the green in the long term by environmental risks, the first being extreme weather events, so climate change, and that's also on the short term risks. The second one, so the second long-term risk estimated by the World Economic Forum is biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And we can see also from the same report here how the World Economic Forum shows how all these risks, whether they be environmental, but also very much non-environmental, economic, societal, etc., are all interconnected, right? And so, this complex diagram shows how, examples of how many of these things are all interconnected. A recent report that came out last year by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so IPBES, which we'll be talking about later in the talk, came out with this report kind of dubbed shorthand as the Nexus Assessment Report. The long name is a thematic assessment on interlinkages among water, biodiversity, food, health, and climate isn't there in the title, but is very much there. So that's essentially what the report is on. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner the nexus elements. So again, these are biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate. And the report talks about how all these different so-called nexus elements are linked to each other, and indeed kind of in positive and in negative ways. So these are all kind of interlinked crises that if one worsens, they can compound each other. So if one worsens, the other can worsen as well. But if some kind of improve, then that can also simultaneously improve the others. And then this middle diagram over here that says nature-oriented nexus is a kind of example of a kind of scenario or pathway forward if you kind of do nature positive actions, that all the nexus elements kind of tend to be in balanced, as in like the best possible outcomes overall. And this is from the same report, so don't worry, you don't need to kind of know, every single thing on this graph. But again, it just highlights those interlinkages, right? Between, again, you have the 5 nexus elements color-coded and kind of listed at the bottom. At the top of the graph, you have kind of land use change, which I've added in, it's what is land use change? It's kind of a nice way to say, well, really, it's the destruction of nature, right? It's deforestation, it's transforming into agricultural land. And so if we kind of follow some of the arrows, we don't need to follow all of them, but let's look at the purple ones first. So you have land use change causing an increased greenhouse gas emissions, of course, and that in turn intensifying climate change. And then you have that in turn intensifying a whole bunch of stuff, but you can see an arrow from intensified climate change to the green box, which is reduced biodiversity, right? So these are just some of the examples. And again, I won't go through all the interlinkages here. So what are some of the drivers of biodiversity loss? So there are 5 direct drivers and then indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. The first one is land use change, or sea use change. So that can be deforestation, for example. The second one is direct exploitation. So you can think of that as, for example, overfishing, so the direct harvesting and over-harvesting of natural resources. The third one is climate change. So the third greatest driver of biodiversity loss is climate change. And people are estimating more and more that as climate change worsens and accelerate, this may well move, unfortunately, from driver number 3 in severity to actually the number 1 driver in severity. And so we mustn't let it get to that point. The fourth driver is, pollution. So that can be, for example, pesticides in the environment. And the fifth is invasive alien species. And then these are kind of underpinned by these indirect drivers. And so these would include socioeconomic factors. You can see some indirect drivers on the left-hand side of the slide. So these can be either demographic, sociocultural, economic, right? We can talk about kind of capitalism, we could talk about institutions, conflicts, and ultimately these are linked back to kind of values, human values and behaviors, right? And I think, we all know that biodiversity loss is accelerating. Just some quick stats here. So we may have heard this kind of, statement before that humans are causing a 6th mass extinction. So the rate of species extinction is a lot higher than it has been, magnitudes higher than it has been historically. Another stat, currently 1 million species of animals and plants are threatened with extinction. And just to give us kind of a ballpark of, to put this number into perspective, this is out of an estimated about 8.7 million total species found on Earth. But of course, that estimate is very uncertain. And wildlife populations have declined by about 69% in the past 50 years. We also know, as I mentioned, that climate change is a big driver of biodiversity loss, and climate change will make biodiversity loss worse. And so this figure over here highlights the difference between what a 1.5 degree world versus a 2 degree world will look like for biodiversity. So for example, the first one here, the species loss of vertebrates is estimated to be twice as worse in a 2 degree world than a 1.5. Plant loss is twice as worse. The loss of insects is estimated to be 3 times worse. So you can see that these are not at all kind of linear, right? As we move from a 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, the impacts become, much more severe than just kind of a linear worsening, right? Then we have the loss of ecosystems from 7% to 13%. And of course, which is devastating, the estimated loss of coral reefs, which in a 1.5 degree world would be 70 to 90%, but in a 2 degree world is up to 99%. So this just kind of points out how important it is to kind of keep ourselves as close as possible to 1.5 or as below or as far below 2 degrees as possible, right? Similarly here, we have kind of, this diagram showing what a 1.5 versus 2 versus 3 degree world is, and we can see that it just gets exponentially worse in terms of mammal loss, habitat loss, biodiversity loss in a warmer world. And so there are many different kind of complex interlinkages in many different directions between climate and between biodiversity. So we know that climate change and biodiversity loss share some of the same drivers. So for instance, land use change or deforestation is a driver of both climate change and is a driver of biodiversity loss. We also know that, of course, as we've talked about, climate change itself is a driver of biodiversity loss. And so therefore, we know that limiting climate change can help to minimize biodiversity loss, right? How, like solving, or maybe not solving, but kind of minimizing one crisis can help to minimize another crisis. And we also know that actions to tackle biodiversity loss can also help to solve climate change. So for example, stopping deforestation, right, is an action that can be kind of aimed at tackling biodiversity loss, but will simultaneously help to tackle climate change as well. But we need to be careful because it's not always a win-win-win-win in all the directions. There may be cases where some actions aimed at tackling climate change may actually harm biodiversity. So for instance, and I have a slide that talks about this later, sometimes you have instances of people, companies saying that they want to plant monocultures because they've scientifically calculated that this particular species of trees is extremely fast growing and extremely fast at sequestering carbon. So it's going to sequester, X amount of carbon over X amount of acres, etc. However, in this hypothetical scenario, it would be a monoculture, which would be not good at all for biodiversity and would, perhaps even replace some of the native biodiversity in the area. So we need to be careful about these instances where trade-offs might happen. But let's kind of take a step back and I've been saying the word biodiversity a lot already in these first 15 minutes of this talk. What actually is biodiversity and why is it important? So biodiversity stands for biological diversity, diversity of life. So it's really like the variability of life. It talks about genetic diversity, but also diversity of different species and also the diversity of ecosystems as well. And why is it important? So there are kind of two different categories that can be helpful to think of here. The first category is biodiversity's intrinsic value. So it's really the value in and of itself that species, that ecosystems have, and their right to exist. So it's like a philosophical, moral argument that these species, these ecosystems have evolved over millennia, same as us. They have just as much a right to exist on this beautiful planet of ours, irrespective of whether they are helpful or useful or valuable to humans, right? So that's the intrinsic value in itself. And then the second category is this anthropocentric value. So that is the value that it has to humans, right? And so here I'm going to break for a bit of a Menti poll. So I'll give you the code in a second, but it won't be quite ready. I'll need to stop sharing my screen. But the overall question is, why is biodiversity important? So I'm just going to go to a different screen now. Give me a second. I'll let you know when it's ready. Okay. So I think it's ready. You can start submitting your answers. Yeah. Oh, I see. So we have answers, but they're not popping up right away. How do I get them to pop up right away? I'm seeing, okay, but it still says 0 have responded. You guys are just like logging in. Okay. So hopefully the answers will pop up once people start submitting their answers. Good, good. Okay, first answer has popped up. Amazing. So why is biodiversity important? We're seeing stable ecosystems, health, balance, yeah, like beauty, keeping CO2 levels balanced, natural resources, healthier soils, cycling, yeah, preventing the spread of disease, so health. Yeah, loving these answers. Yeah. I'll definitely, yeah, there's loads of you on here and only 24 answers. So I'll keep it open for as many people as possible to have a chance to respond. Some great answers here. Let me see. Protecting from disaster. Yes. Disaster risk reduction. I'm seeing another disaster defense there. Quality of life. I'm seeing agriculture there as well. Aesthetic. Yeah, greenhouse gas reduction, carbon sequestration, lots of that. Livelihoods. Fantastic. Yeah, and then the words that are really kind of coming out as big in the middle are our balance, our health, our ecosystem services, natural resources. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I think I might cut it off there. Sorry if some people haven't gotten the chance to submit their answers yet. But yeah, hopefully you can all see the high diversity of answers that we're getting. Okay, ending that, and I'm just going to share my other screen again. Just give me a second to fix my presenter view here. All right, back on track. Okay, yes, exactly. So you guys were spot on with all your incredible answers. So why is biodiversity important? So biodiversity is really is secures all that we need from nature. So many of you responded ecosystem services, right? Or another term that's come up in the past few years that is similar to ecosystem services, but kind of more wider encompassing is nature's contributions to people. And so on the left-hand side, we can see some examples of this, right? So medicine, some of you mentioned medicine in your responses, clean water, food. Food, for example, there's a picture of fish, right? So like food and fisheries is a source of, or like, fisheries is a source of food for many people across the world, raw materials such as timber. Many of you mentioned disaster risk reduction, so flood control is a good example here, but also climate regulation. When you have green spaces, that means that you don't have as many temperature spikes, right? Cleaning the water, cleaning the air, for pollination as well. I'm not sure, I didn't see, maybe very possible someone mentioned that. I didn't take notice of it. But also, yeah, having that carbon sequestration, that also fits into the climate regulation. But then also other things, like many people mentioned aesthetics and beauty, but then there's also kind of recreation, there's education as well, and spirituality. So yeah, a lot of kind of so many very important aspects here. It's also been shown through various studies that higher biodiversity improves the flow and the resilience of ecosystem services. So that means that ecosystem services, there'll be more of them. So that's the flow, they'll be kind of, better and more, but also the resilience. So if there's a kind of shock in the system, some sort of disturbance, some sort of problem with, the provisioning of the ecosystem service, it's more likely to bounce back faster when you have higher biodiversity in the system. And other studies have also shown that biodiversity increases the resilience to climate extremes. So this study over here, Hutchison and al., showed that in Panama, when there was a hurricane, the more biodiverse plots of planted forest were able to bounce back and sequester more carbon faster than the ones that were kind of monocultures and less diversity after the hurricane. And people depend on biodiversity, right? We all depend on nature. It's really healthy ecosystems that sustain us daily. And while we all depend on nature, 1.2 billion people in especially tropical countries are both highly and directly dependent on nature. So us who live in cities may feel a bit more like indirectly dependent on nature, but there are many people who are still very much directly dependent on nature for basic daily human needs every single day. And nature is of high cultural and spiritual value to many, especially Indigenous peoples, but not only. And biodiversity is the bedrock on which healthy economies and human well-being depend, right? So you can look at the right-hand figure over here with all the SDGs, and we can see that those kind of that base, that rounder, larger circle at the bottom is really kind of everything having to do with the biosphere. So a healthy, stable climate, clean water, clean oceans, and then life on land, SDG 15, which is essentially biodiversity, and everything else from the economy then builds on top of that, right? So without that foundation, we wouldn't have kind of thriving economies and the other SDGs. Okay, the next section is on biodiversity international policy, and here I'll be talking to you a little bit about the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the Global Biodiversity Framework. So some of you may already know this background, that in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, there were 3 sister Rio Conventions that were created. The one that many of you probably know best is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, right? And I imagine that most of your sessions in this in the School of Climate Change will be focusing on, of course, climate change and the UNFCCC, right? But there were also 2 other smaller, kind of lesser known kind of sister conventions created at the same time. One was the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, so the focus of the next few slides, and then a third one on the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification as well. So here's a bit of a kind of timeline, not all encompassing all the milestones, but a timeline of these 3 different conventions here. And so you see, they were all established at the same point. They all have kind of COPs in varying different years, and we'll get to that in a little bit. We can see that in 2010, so on the green middle line, there was something called the Aichi targets that were established in 2010. And then in 2022 or in 2020, the Aichi targets kind of ran out because they were only supposed to span 10 years, and a new set of targets was established to replace the Aichi targets, and this was the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I'll talk about this on the next slide, but you can see that you have the equivalent on the upper line, which is the Paris Agreement, and you can see that this year in 2026, it's another triple COP year. So some years only have 1 COP, which is usually the climate COP, because the climate COP happens every single year. So of course, last year we just had COP 30. This year will be COP 31. So that's every year. But for the 2 other conventions, the COPs are every 2 years. So that's why, for example, last year, there was only the climate COP happening, but every 2 years, it's normally like a triple COP year. So in 2026, we're going to have all 3 COPs happening at various different dates. And so since I'm assuming that many of you will be moderately, I hope a little bit, it doesn't matter if you're not familiar with the UNFCCC, this slide is kind of comparing the structure of the UNFCCC to the CBD to kind of give you a better idea of the CBD, right? So the CBD, again, is Convention on Biological Diversity. So on the UNFCCC side, on the climate side, you have the Paris Agreement, which is, of course, the big agreement. And on the CBD side, you have the Global Biodiversity Framework, which has been kind of hailed as the equivalent of the Paris Agreement. Both have COPs, as I've said, so this can be quite confusing in the news. It's like everyone's like, oh, I thought it was COP 30, but now we're talking about COP 17. I don't understand. How come we're going back? So there are climate COPs and there are COPs for the other conventions as well. Both have different national targets. So in the climate side, you have what's called nationally determined contributions, NDC. So this is when each country kind of submits what they're going to do individually as a nation to limit climate change to the agreed upon kind of temperature limits, right? And on the biodiversity side, you have something called NbSI. So these are national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and it's very similar in their kind of format where each country is in charge of creating, developing, and then submitting its own NbSI, and then you kind of look at the sum of all these submitted national commitments and see after that there's various stock take points. Given all these national commitments, are we on track to meet the overall global goal, right? So this happens both in the biodiversity space and in the climate space. They have different funding mechanisms, and they have different intergovernmental science policy bodies. So you may have heard of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so that is, the big intergovernmental science policy panel body that creates reports, very important reports on climate change, what's happening with climate change, how to solve it, how to adapt to it, etc. And similarly, on the CBD side, you have IPBES. So that was in my kind of second slide or first slide. I highlighted a report by IPBES, the Nexus Assessment Report, right? My last slide in this presentation all the way at the end is also about an upcoming IPBES conference, which is next week. So I'll get into that a bit more, but this gives you an idea of it being able to compare. So here, looking at the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So it was agreed upon at COP15 in Montreal, Canada in 2022. This COP actually was hosted by China, but it couldn't actually take place physically in China due to COVID regulations still being in place there. That's why it took place in Canada. The GBF is valid until 2030. So we only have 4 or 5 more years to kind of get to these to reach these targets, because basically in the CBD a new agreement is kind of created every 10 years. So as I said, the HT target spanned from 2010 to 2020. This is 2020 to 2030, but there was a delay because of COVID. It's hailed as the Paris Agreement equivalent of biodiversity, so I said that several times, and it's really our international compass for tackling biodiversity loss. So what does this kind of big agreement have? Well, it has one vision, it has one mission, it has 4 goals and 23 targets. The overall vision is a world of living in harmony with nature. And then the kind of 2030 mission is to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path of recovery. So the goal is, or the mission is really by 2030 to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Again, going back to the vision of living in a world in harmony with nature. These are the 23 different targets. And of course, don't worry about, looking at all of them, remembering all of them, but it's really interesting to kind of look at a few here to see how diverse this convention is in terms of the types of issues that it tackles. So for example, on the climate side, you have basically, the temperature target in terms of mitigation, keeping warming as much as possible to 1.5 and as under 2 degrees as possible, right? And then you have, some targets having to do with adaptation, some targets having to do with loss and damage and funding. But in the CBD, it deals with such a wide range of issues. So you have things ranging from spatial planning of different biodiversity areas, you have restoration, you have conservation, you have, dealing with wild species trade, you have invasive alien species, you have stuff having to do with pollutions and pesticides, climate change, you have sustainable agriculture here, you have urban biodiversity here, and then there's kind of other targets that are kind of wider ranging on integrating policy, taking a whole of society approach. You have targets on sustainable consumption and food waste. You have disclosure for businesses. You have stuff on harmful subsidies and incentives. Of course, there's a finance target, biosafety and technology, so everything having to do with GMOs. And then you have specific targets on equitable participation and on a gender-responsive approach. So really a wide variety of issues here. the kind of flagship target that most people hear of first when they hear of the Global Biodiversity Framework is this so-called 30 by 30 target here. So target 3, 30 by 30. And so this is really the target talking about the protection and conservation of areas. And so this is, here's the target here, the exact wording from the UN wording here that was negotiated very, very carefully, word for word, comma by comma, by a whole variety of different stakeholders, all nations, well, all nations except for the US, because the US is not party to the CBD. But all other nations, with a lot of input from other stakeholders, including academia, including NGOs, including indigenous peoples here. So to ensure and enable that by 2030, at least 30% of areas are conserved, etc. Then there's some important stuff in the middle. And then I've highlighted in yellow at the end some language that is really important, that kind of ended up in, it was very good that ended up in this target. So conserving this 30% while respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their traditional territories. And we know that with looking back at the history of biodiversity conservation, there have been many human rights violations and many instances of Indigenous peoples and local communities getting kicked off of their territories, getting excluded from their own traditional territories in the name of so-called fortress conservation, right? And so with this target over here, it was quite controversial while it was being negotiated, because people were quite worried that this incentive and drive for more area-based conservation would again incentivize more exclusions of traditional peoples from their own territories. And this was quite a win in the end, and most people, almost everyone, was really actually happy with the final wording of this target, that it managed to get this wording on making sure that you're conserving, yes, but you're doing this while respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples over their traditional territories. And so the issue of and the topic of human rights was really central to the talks and the negotiations on the Global Biodiversity Framework, and is still just as much very central to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So many people, say human rights must be at the heart of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And it might be a little bit perhaps foreign at first to think, okay, how does biodiversity, we think nature over there, link to human rights? These are some kind of human rights risks and considerations when we're talking about biodiversity considerations. So as I've mentioned, there have been instances of protected areas risking the expropriation and the exclusion of local communities in their territories. We need to be very, very aware of the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, that's IPLC's acronym, over their traditional territories. And often these rights may not yet be enshrined in law, in the legal system. So often the legal system may be kind of working against these types of, or like just historically, because of the legacy of colonialism, the rights may not be enshrined in the legal system yet, although more and more countries are moving to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples in their legal systems more and more. We need to be careful to always respect free and prior informed consent. So this is a kind of very important UN principle, acronym is FPIC, of always making sure that anything that takes place on a territory or land that is traditional to Indigenous peoples, any activity must go by free prior and informed consent before the activity or project or whatever it is ends up happening. Another important thing to kind of think of in the context of biodiversity and human rights at that intersection between biodiversity and human rights is access to resources and benefit sharing. So making sure that if you're creating, again, for example, a protected area, that people who have been using those resources, that land, still have access to a customary sustainable use of that land, of those resources. And then also securing benefits. Who benefits? Securing the benefits for those most vulnerable from those resources, including digital sequencing information. So digital sequencing information is basically kind of like a scientific big term for essentially genetic information, so kind of like DNA. So you can take the example of, for instance, a scientist working with a private company that go into, say, a tropical forest in Borneo and discover a mushroom that has particular compounds in its DNA that can be really good at creating a particular drug that, I don't know, this is, completely hypothetical, that helps with obesity. Then that company will, can take that DNA and through their work synthesize various different drugs, or it could be vaccines or whatever, for various different, medical conditions. In this case, I gave the example of obesity, and then of course, they would then sell that and get a bunch of money, right? But that money, often what's happened in the past is that none of that money goes back to those indigenous peoples and local communities who have been conserving that resource for millennia. The only reason that again, completely hypothetical, that hypothetical mushroom exists, and that company and that scientist was able to actually find that mushroom, was because of the local communities there, and yet they often get zero benefit from the kind of sale of those, drugs or medicines down the line. So it's how can the benefits from these resources go back to those who conserved them in the first place. And then also looking at other things like gender, like inclusivity, like equitable governance. We're talking about land systems here, right? These are very complex, and there are many different competing interests and competing dynamics when we're talking about land systems. And so all these different kind of equity concerns really come into play here. Additionally, this is interestingly different from climate, because of course climate change, CO2 coats the globe pretty much evenly, where the whole globe feels climate change. Of course, some regions are affected more, of course, but with biodiversity is not distributed evenly across the globe. So it's much higher naturally in these kind of tropical regions, right? And so that's, interesting from a scientific perspective, from an ecologist perspective. But let's think about what are the justice and international policy implications of this. If we say, for example, well, there's a huge global importance of these mega diverse countries like Brazil, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, and like Indonesia, that are in these biodiversity hotspots. And so the international community globally has a particular interest that Brazil specifically conserves its Amazon. But of course, its Amazon is under the sovereignty of its national territory. And it's much more important globally that Brazil specifically conserves its Amazon than, say, Argentina. Of course, Argentina is extremely important and has amazing, beautiful, unique biodiversity as well. But just in terms of this biodiversity gradient, there is just so many more naturally occurring species in these areas. So kind of, what do we do about that, right? So these bring us to questions of issues of global justice. So for example, the North, for example, the UK has been allowed to exploit their natural resources for millennia more than the global South. Who decides which bit of land and which bit of sea gets protected? What about the people living there? How do they get a say? Who gets the benefits from digital sequencing information of genetic resources? So that's the whole, example with the DNA of the hypothetical mushroom, etc. How are these benefits divided up? How are they shared? What are the mechanisms for that to actually happen? Who enforces whether that private company, is basically forced to give? Because it's nice to say, oh, companies should give back, but of course, if it affects their bottom line, they're not going to do it voluntarily. So there needs to be some sort of enforcement mechanism, right? What about traditional ecological knowledge? And when that is shared, do the people originally holding that knowledge, how do they benefit from that? Who will enforce this free, prior, and informed consent, right? Will it be the governments? What if the governments don't have the capacity for enforcement? What if the governments are the ones infringing on this free, prior, informed consent? Who will enforce it then? How can we ensure that those vulnerable and those marginalized populations and communities do not get further marginalized? Who will verify and enforce these social safeguards? How will land rights contested land rights be dealt with? And which countries should invest what money and where, right? So I don't have answers at all to all these questions, but these are just some of the things that are interesting to think about and that hopefully might inspire you to think about in future work to answer some of these questions, right? Because these are super live questions at the moment. Then going back to the targets, so I mentioned target 3, that was 30 by 30, right? The conservation of area of land, and then I talked a bit about human rights phase into that. The only other target here that I'm going to highlight and go into is target 8, the target on climate change. So this is about biodiversity and climate change linkages. So I'll read this one out word by word because it's quite short. This is the actual wording in the actual kind of UN document of the target. So the target is to minimize the impact of climate change and ocean acidification on biodiversity and increase its resilience through mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction actions, including through nature-based solutions and/or ecosystem-based approaches, while minimizing negative and fostering positive impacts of climate action on biodiversity. So this part highlighted, well, first of all, it's talking about minimizing the impact of climate change on biodiversity. So that goes back to, our first part where we said that climate change was the 3rd biggest driver of biodiversity loss, right? So we want to minimize that. But yeah, this part in yellow, minimizing the negative impacts of climate action on biodiversity and fostering the positive one. So this is alluding to what I talked about, where I was saying it's not always win-win. It's not always that every single positive thing that you do for the climate will also be positive for biodiversity. Often it is. In some cases, we need to be careful, and it isn't, right? So through the case of monocultures, for example, right? So, and I'll go into that in a slide in a bit. And then you can also see, yeah, actually, this is the slide. So there can be trade-offs. So climate and biodiversity potential trade-offs. So in some cases, misguided climate action can undermine biodiversity. So as I kind of already gave the example of monocultures or afforestation in the wrong places, so planting trees in the wrong places can actually be harmful for biodiversity. And sometimes that we've seen in this kind of world of nature-based solutions, of restoration, there can be an excessive focus on tree planting. And sometimes when there's an excessive focus on tree planting, this can actually risk displacing other critical ecosystems. So of course, we all think of, okay, solve climate change, plant a tree. Trees are fantastic. Most of the time they are, but we can't forget about these other critical ecosystems. So wetlands, peatlands, grasslands, these are incredibly important for biodiversity. They hold their own unique biodiversity. And when we plant trees over these other critical ecosystems, we basically ruin these ecosystems and lose the biodiversity that came with them. So we need to be careful of that. And we also need to be careful of valuing carbon over and above the other multiple benefits that nature provides. So when I asked you in the Menti poll, to talk about all the different other benefits that nature provides, those ecosystem services, those nature's contributions to people, we can see that there's so many other benefits than just carbon sequestration and just reduction of greenhouse gases, right? And so when you reduce when you kind of reduce to just thinking about carbon sequestration and only prioritize that, you might end up planting monocultures and not paying attention to the other benefits and therefore not kind of planning to provide those other benefits essentially. And then there's also big risks around the energy transition, right? So of course, for climate action, we need an energy transition, extremely important. But there are some actions in the energy transition that are potentially harmful. Now, that doesn't mean that we should slow the energy transition. It just means that we need to plan carefully. We need to be aware of those trade-offs, and we need to plan to minimize those trade-offs as much as possible while still not slowing that energy transition down too much, right? So there can be big risks and concerns around the amount of land used for bioenergy capture and storage. So this is BECCS. This is, for example, when monocultures of it can be corn, it can be sometimes palm oil, but it can also be trees sometimes that are planted in large quantities in monocultures and then are then kind of fed to an incinerator, are burned. Those carbon emissions are stored, which is good for the climate, but that a huge amount of land was just kind of used for a monoculture and was not used for biodiversity. And sometimes even, these types of monocultures for BECCS can replace a native forest. Or there also has been some cases of native old growth forests in Canada that have been cut down for wood pellets for the use of BECCS actually in the UK. And so these, are kind of big scandals because, of course, it makes no sense when this happens. So we just need to be careful of this. And then there are other issues like mining for critical minerals that can harm biodiversity. Of course, critical minerals are essential for the energy transition, but it's just to be aware of these trade-offs and how can we plan and minimize them when and where possible. And as you may have noticed, this target 8 also calls for the use of nature-based solutions, which is the topic of the second half of the presentation here. But what I will do now, I know I've been talking for a long time, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to pause for any questions. So this is basically the midway point where I'm going to pause for some questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I'll see if there are any clarifying questions, some questions maybe for 10 or so minutes, or before I go back to the rest of the presentation, and then there'll be time at the end for more questions as well.
If there are questions, can you hear me okay, Audrey, through this?
Yes. Yeah.
So if there are questions, and if you can say your question at 6 minutes, then I'll feed it back through the mic here so we dig. We also have questions online, and Hannah, I'll go to you to. But maybe.
Yeah, sorry. Should I start reading some of them in the Q&A, or
so
will they be
the
selected?
first questions from the room, sorry, and it was
okay.
expanding the bioenergy and carbon capture.
Yeah.
Just expanding on it a bit more, if
that
would be possible.
Yeah, of course. So often what it is you'll have, I guess, like a field or many fields of corn, let's say, and then that corn will all be harvested and then turned into, I guess, like it could be biofuel or it could be like burnt, and then that would basically be in a big kind of carbon storage plant. So instead of the like burning and the emissions going out back into the atmosphere, it would then be sequestered underground and stored underground in like a kind of underground, I guess, cavern or like I can't remember the word, but yeah, basically underground. So that would mean that those emissions are then stored, so we're sucking out carbon from the atmosphere. So from a climate perspective, this is an argument that can be beneficial, and we've seen in different IPCC reports that that a lot of the kind of future scenarios for bringing climate change down rely on bioenergy capture and storage and BECCS. The problem is, well, there are a few problems, but the main problem for biodiversity is that it takes so much land to actually grow a significant amount of these crops, whether it's corn, whether it's trees, whatever you're growing and then burning. It takes so much land. And so to reach the kind of estimates of, you know, the amount of land that we would actually need to make a significant difference in the kind of sucking down in this shape that we would need to reach our temperature goals, the amount of land is ridiculous. I can't remember the actual estimate, but you know, it would be like, oh, the whole size of Brazil or the whole size of Australia, and you know, these types of numbers. And so of course from a biodiversity perspective, which of course biodiversity requires you know, um, land to be conserved in its I want to say natural state. Of course, you know, natural state doesn't necessarily exclude humans, of course. It can be with humans also living there. But yeah, basically the issue of limited land availability is the crux here.
In your question. The question is there anything that's connected the COP16 outputs to last year's COP30 outputs in relation to biodiversity?
Yeah, fantastic question. So this is something that I work on a lot. So essentially in the kind of, you know, international policy space, there's a whole, you know, large group, I would say community of us working, you know, across NGOs, across academia, across the actual countries, parties, to ensure that there are more kind of synergies between both conventions, between the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Convention, to get some solid kind of negotiated text in both conventions on this. So at COP16, there were some really good outcomes on climate and biodiversity synergies. There was a whole big decision on it, and it talked about kind of various different things, asking for submissions on ideas, coming out with various things, and then some of that fed into COP30. Now at COP30, the outcomes were not very positive. So it did feed into the discussions that happened, and there was a whole agenda item actually on cooperation with other conventions, and the primary discussions there were actually on cooperation with the CBD and basically biodiversity. But the outcome wasn't very successful. In the end, countries couldn't agree. It kind of became a bit of a negotiating chip for other things, and it was kind of kicked down the line. So discussions were kicked down the line to COP31. So there was some very, very light language, but essentially nothing happened. But these things take time. So the people, you know, that are working towards this are hopeful that in future COPs there'll be more solid language on this kind of thing.
There are questions online. Maybe I'll get our moderator to tell me and then I'll feed it to. So we have a question from Nyla from Indonesia, and she's asking how we can hold international corporations accountable in terms of biodiversity targets, specifically maybe in the context of Indonesia, if you have any specific knowledge on that.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any specific knowledge on Indonesia, but that's a really fantastic question. I think it's not my particular specialty, working on holding private sector accountable. I think I would just say, you know, there can be a lot of public pressure from NGOs and civil society, pressuring and raising awareness about the damage that that these industries are causing in a particular area. However, I will point to, my last slide in the presentation is about the upcoming conference in Manchester, and then a new report will be coming out. So this report will be coming out in about a week and a half's time, so right after the conference. And the topic of this report is business and biodiversity. And that report will have loads, so it's not out yet, but that report will have loads of recommendations to answer that question, essentially. Loads of recommendations on how businesses can reduce their impact on biodiversity, and loads of recommendations on how other stakeholders, governments, NGOs, etc., can support businesses in reducing their impact on biodiversity. So stay tuned for that report, basically.
Is there any more questions from in the room? Is there someone else? Was it someone at the back? Yeah. Right. Do you want to ask a question? Yeah, the question is, if you are familiar with any research to do with double counting within biodiversity.
Yeah, super interesting. But does the person mean double counting just within biodiversity, or biodiversity and climate? Because we've heard that term double counting has been thrown around in a lot of conversations on this kind of topic of biodiversity and climate synergies and policy, where some people who are maybe a bit more hesitant about these synergies speak to the risk of double counting finance. So finance that is meant for either climate or for biodiversity. So basically how it works is that, most countries make pledges they pledge this amount of finance for climate, this amount of finance for biodiversity. If there is a particular project, let's say, which tackles both, that could allow countries who maybe don't have the best intentions to say, oh, well, actually, we did spend 2 million on biodiversity and 2 million on climate, but actually they only spent 2 million overall instead of the actual 4 million. So that would be, in my circles, what some people talk about when they talk about double counting, risks of double counting of finance. Now others, have a counter argument to that, to say, of course, badly intentioned actors could do that, but if we just have the right accountability systems in place and actually, properly track that finance, then, we should be able to solve that, and it shouldn't be so much of an issue. So I'm not sure if that's what the person in the room is referring to, or
Yeah, I think it was both in the climate and biodiversity cases, but thank you very much for your answer. We might take one more question from online.
Sure.
As the last one.
Great.
So this question is asking, is the loss and damage fund mechanism also focusing on alleviating the biodiversity crisis? And if so, what's the progress updates on this?
That is such a good question, and I wish I knew the answer better, right? It's not my area of expertise necessarily, but it's such an interesting one. And I know there have been papers, and there have been people talking about kind of, some of that money in the loss and damage fund going towards, of course, lost and damaged ecosystems, right? So that's definitely a very live and really fascinating, and kind of like at the edge of at the edge of research right now, at the edge of what everyone's kind of talking about. Yeah, I definitely read a paper on that. So I would, I can't give a better answer, but I would definitely recommend looking that up. So loss and damage and the money from the loss and damage fund going to nature, to ecosystems, is, yeah, you could do a whole PhD, or I'm sure there's many people doing a whole PhD on that at the moment, because it's really a live question right now. Super interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for the Q&A session. We can get back to the presentation. That's good.
Okay. Super. So I'll share my slide, my screen again. Okay. So the second part, I'll dive into nature-based solutions a little bit more. Oops. Okay. So what are nature-based solutions? So I've started us off here with quite a wordy slide. It is the multilaterally agreed upon definition of nature-based solutions. So this is the definition that was agreed by the UN, by all parties, all countries around the world have agreed to this one definition. And as UN definitions go, it's very wordy. Every word, every comma was negotiated over and over again. I will read it out, so bear with me. So nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems, which address social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience and biodiversity benefits. So essentially, you can break it down into several parts, and we'll be doing that on the next slides. But it's various actions, including protection, conservation, restoration, etc. And these actions need to address societal challenges. And then they absolutely need to, by definition, and here the things are in bold, provide benefits for human well-being and provide benefits for biodiversity. So if they don't provide that human well-being and those biodiversity benefits, it doesn't adhere to the definition. So kind of a bit more, tangentially, or not tangentially, but like practically here, what are we actually talking about? So 4 different kind of category of actions. So the first is protection. So this involves, the conservation of existing ecosystems. So it can even be, for example, the titling of land. So land titling to protect indigenous territories, which would then hopefully, ideally, also protect existing ecosystems. It can be restoration, so restoring destroyed or degraded ecosystems. It can be sustainable management, so improved sustainable management of land, of fisheries. So this would include things like agroforestry, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, that kind of thing. And then the 4th category is creation. So this is it could be the creation of novel ecosystems. So if we think of urban nature-based solutions, urban green spaces, but also some marine solutions like artificial oyster reefs to help with climate adaptation. So these 4 categories: protection, restoration, management, and creation. This is a bit of a shorthand on the right-hand side, the text, the shorthand definition of nature-based solutions, just to kind of a bit snappier than the kind of long UN definition. So again, nature-based solutions involve working with nature. So these actions working with nature to address societal challenges. So you need to kind of be focused on addressing various societal challenges and providing benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity. And now moving to the kind of figure on the right-hand side here. I know it's quite complex. I'll walk us through it. So if you start with the middle of the figure where it says nature-based solutions in black writing over there. So nature-based solutions, and then under that you have in white writing, people working with nature. So nature-based solutions are people working with nature. What does that entail? Under that, in kind of smaller writing, you have those 4 different categories, right? So you have the protection, restoration, management, and creation. So you have people working with nature, doing these things, doing the protection, doing the restoration, doing the management, etc. And then going to the kind of yellow arrows that are spreading out up top, these actions are then creating what we talked about before as these ecosystem services, right? As these benefits. So you have in blue in the white writing, The blue section, a lot of the same, going back to the same ecosystem services that all of you responded in your Menti poll, right? You have that greenhouse gas reduction, you have flood and erosion control, coastal defense, cooling and shading, water and food security, you have livelihoods. I remember people putting that on the Menti. You have cultural values, and you also have social capital. And then all of these ecosystem services, all of these benefits can ultimately contribute to human well-being, to what we might want to call sustainable development. And we're also seeing biodiversity benefits, right? So we're seeing, these ecosystem services that are more kind of anthropocentric benefits. But of course, through these actions of protection, restoration, sustainable management, etc., we're seeing benefits for biodiversity. And nature-based solutions always need to benefit biodiversity. So we're seeing biodiversity at the top in blue, and then we're also in the same diagram seeing biodiversity at the bottom in the yellow section in the kind of red writing, right? So biodiversity happens twice in this diagram. And so with that, we're basically trying to kind of represent how nature-based solutions cannot take place without biodiversity. So it's really biodiversity that is underpinning even kind of the ability to create these benefits. It's through biodiversity, it's through working with biodiversity, it's through these ecosystems being biodiverse that we're then able to get these ecosystem services out of them, right? So biodiversity is a foundational property and an outcome of a nature-based solution. And there really are no solutions without biodiversity. You're not going to get those benefits that you want from nature-based solutions without having them underpinned by biodiverse ecosystems. So to qualify as a nature-based solution, an action must support or enhance biodiversity, right? So that's what we've been saying. It must be an outcome. If you have a kind of project that, whatever is planting a bunch of trees for climate, etc., but actually it's not good for biodiversity, it's a monoculture, well, then that cannot and should not be adhere to the it doesn't adhere to the definition of a nature-based solution. And then this second point goes to the kind of underpinning. So the NBS concept is based on the science and knowledge that healthy biodiverse ecosystems produce a diverse range of ecosystem services. So those ecosystem services are only produced because you have a healthy biodiverse ecosystem kind of providing it. So biodiversity is not just like a fun co-benefit of nature-based solutions, but it's really, again, repeating myself here, but kind of drilling the point home, a necessary precondition underpinning the successful provisioning of benefits here. There are some things that we must be careful with. So there are some concerns around the kind of discourse and rhetoric around nature-based solutions, some concerns around greenwashing and around human rights. So when we're dealing with land and with nature, as I kind of briefly mentioned before, like land systems are very complex. All land around the world is kind of there's competition for various different land uses from various different stakeholders and various different kind of priorities. So when dealing with land and with nature, people's rights can be violated and livelihoods can be destroyed. So when we're talking about nature-based solutions, of course, they're going to involve kind of working and doing different projects with various pieces of land, of ocean. And with this, there's a potential for land grabs and exclusions. There's also a risk of greenwashing with carbon offsets and being used as a kind of dangerous distraction from reducing fossil fuels. So we have seen several instances of big fossil fuel companies, for instance, Shell, etc., saying, oh, we have this like nature-based solutions, program, and we're planting, this many trees and implementing all these fantastic nature-based solutions. First of all, need to be skeptical of, okay, are the so-called nature-based solutions that they are implementing, are they actually good? Do they actually support biodiversity? Are they not violating human rights? But even if the nature-based solutions that they are implementing are perfect, ideal, really, really good, they're using that as a kind of greenwashing tool to basically distract from them reducing fossil fuels, right? And so they could be doing all these fantastic projects, but really what we've seen is when we look into their actual investment, it's an extremely small, a fraction of a percentage of an investment of a fossil fuel company might go towards purchasing offsets for nature-based solutions, while the large majority of their ongoing investment is for fossil fuel exploration and fossil fuel development, right? So we need to be careful of that and not let us distract from the crucial importance of reducing fossil fuels. And we must ensure that nature-based solutions are implemented using a human rights-based approach with participatory and equitable governance. So everyone who might benefit or might lose on the ground needs to have a say in the governance. These are some case studies of good nature-based solutions on the left-hand side, and so-called nature-based solutions, but again, they don't fit the definition, projects that have ended up quite disastrously with poor social and ecological outcomes on the right-hand side. So starting from the top left with the good solutions, I'll just quickly go through them so you can get a bit of like a feel of what these things actually can look like. So a really positive project happening in Bolivia in a lowland tropical forest. This was an indigenous council of the Chicana people managing 390,000 hectares of their ancestral lands. And this was projected to avoid 13 megatons of emissions because the land was threatened with deforestation or development, and it was sustainably managed by these peoples. They also had reported reduced slope erosion, so that's kind of good for climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction. It also provided habitat for over 50 endangered species, so much more species than over 50, but 50 endangered species. And it also provided sustainable livelihoods for the people living there. So for example, there were some different agroforestry projects as like a mosaic within the kind of managed area of ancestral land. And it was very kind of bottom up as well, involved land titling. The second good example, B, was a farmer-led pasture lands management system with a silvopastoral system. So that means trees on a kind of grassland. So this was on a grassland, and it protected patches of native vegetation from livestock, so opening up in the dry season only when feedstocks were low. And it resulted in enhanced soil carbon and biodiversity, likely, and there were also reports of reduced soil erosion and enhanced soil fertility, and very importantly for the local people, very year-round food security, whereas they were very much struggling with food security prior to that. And the last positive example here of a good practice nature-based solution was in China, and this is a participatory integrated watershed management project. So in this case, the indigenous Naxi people self-organized into watershed management teams. They empowered vulnerable groups, including women, and they protected and restored different patches of forest and wetland within this watershed, where they also included different agroforestry and sustainable fishing. So again, it was a very like mosaic approach where some forests were like exclusively protected, some are restored, but then some were managed and sustainably harvested. There is estimated that there was increased carbon storage, that there was a decreased risk of erosion. This was a mountainous area, so they were struggling with a lot of erosion, and there was increased local incomes and increased food and water security, and native wildlife returned. So those are some kind of good example, and we can see that they all kind of involve local people, that they don't, infringe on human rights. Then going to the right-hand side over here, a few, kind of high-profile, a bit disastrous projects here that some people were calling nature-based solutions, but that, of course, we're very much saying, these should absolutely not be called nature-based solutions. So in Cambodia, there was this forest declared as as a wildlife sanctuary, but this was done at the exclusion of indigenous people, and they ended up afforesting with non-native monoculture, so planting non-native monoculture. And then this ended up in an increase in illegal logging because the indigenous peoples there were denied access, and so they could no longer patrol the forest. And so prior, they had been patrolling the forest and actually stopping this illegal logging. But because they were no longer to patrol, then big companies came in to log illegally there. And then in addition to this happening, there was this big company called Think Biotech that was granted rights to reforest, quote unquote, 34,000 hectares specifically for climate mitigation. So here we can see again, going back to one of my slides where I mentioned that there can be a risk when one ecosystem service, climate mitigation and greenhouse gas reduction, is prioritized and emphasized above all else. That was the case in this case study. So they kind of, this company only really cared, they were gonna plant all these trees for climate mitigation. And what they ended up doing is very sadly replacing an old growth forest with just an acacia monoculture. So replaced an old growth forest with monoculture because they estimated that that would sequester more carbon than the old growth forest, which of course is very negative for biodiversity and even for carbon because monocultures are way less resilient. So this had negative outcomes for biodiversity and climate mitigation, and also ended up in the further displacement and marginalization of local people. Then in Uganda, there was this other case, quite a high-profile case, this Mount Eglon Uganda Wildlife Authority. So firstly, this kind of forest-absorbing carbon emissions project was really marketed as a triple win by a company selling these carbon credits to offset aviation emissions, and so they aimed to sequester all this carbon by reforesting. But in the end, it relied on uncompensated dispossession and violent eviction of local people. And so this became so controversial and created such big local conflict and a lot of negative international publicity that in the end, the project was abandoned after 10 years and was a complete flop. But obviously good that it was abandoned and that the local people got their land back. But yeah, huge controversy. And lastly, in a marine ecosystem in South Africa, again, this was a top-down implementation of a marine protected area, where essentially this protected area forced the racially based relocation. So specifically, Black people that were relocated or in areas that were primarily with people of color, were relocated. And so this also involved the criminalizations of customs, so of traditional fishing customs, where they had previously, traditionally allowed to fish, that was then criminalized. And then when there were so-called when they did fish, now illegally, there was then a violent suppression of this, now illegal harvesting. And so traditional ecological knowledge was ignored, cultural heritage was eroded, and there was a loss of tenure lives that really led to a loss of food security and a loss of livelihoods for these traditional fisher people in these areas. So, and these case studies are kind of highlighted over here in this science article here, which I helped kind of compile. So it just gives you a bit of a feel of what we're talking about when we're talking about good and negative case studies. So nature-based solutions are for people and by people working with nature as part of nature. And we must recognize that humans and nature are not separate and recognize the plurality of values that nature holds for all different people. So one person may really care about for example, clean water purification kind of element of nature, and another person, another community may really care about the spiritual value that the river holds for their culture. And even though the kind of first person it maybe isn't spiritual or religious in that way, we must still be able to hold this. That's what plurality of values means. It doesn't mean that we all need to agree, all of us, on, okay, all of these things are valuable. We can say, okay, you really value this, I really value that. Let's hold both of those as a kind of plurality of values. And so the extent to which nature brings benefits really depends on how we implement nature-based solutions, right? So we saw that in the kind of previous slide with all those different case studies. It's really all about the how that these things are implemented. And as the kind of general guideline, nature-based solutions must be designed, led, implemented, managed, and monitored by Indigenous peoples and local communities where, if they are located around the project, and Indigenous peoples and local communities must also be the primary beneficiaries of those nature-based solutions occurring on their territories, on their lands. It can't be that all the benefits are global for mitigating climate change. Of course, that's a global benefit, very important. There must be local benefits for the people actually living there. And we know that Indigenous peoples and local communities have been stewards of lands and have been implementing nature-based solutions for millennia, right? And so that's why I think, the term nature-based solutions is maybe a new term, but of course, those kind of 4 different categories of actions: protection, restoration, sustainable management, et cetera, of course, have been around for millennia. And the term nature-based solution is just a kind of it's just a helpful term to package this and to define it and to define what is a good nature-based solution and a bad nature-based solution, or not a nature-based solution. But the actual actions are nothing new. And actions that aim to support nature-based solutions, so if we're aiming to support nature-based solutions, if companies are aiming to fund nature-based solutions, must support Indigenous peoples to continue the work that they've been doing for millennia, protecting and conserving their lands. And so we must let them lead on nature-based solutions. Now, a couple of slides on how nature-based solutions tackle climate change. So first climate mitigation, and then I'll go into climate adaptation, and then we'll be right close to the end. So we're almost finished. Well, a little bit. Yeah, we're getting there. So this figure, this kind of bar graph over here shows a breakdown of the total anthropogenic emissions globally. So globally, this is from a few years ago, but it stayed kind of stable or even increased. So it's around 59, 60 gigatons CO2 equivalent per year that humans are emitting from all these different sources. Here we can see that 22% of all of these emissions, so between about a quarter, a bit less than a quarter, between a quarter and a fifth, are from the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors, so from the AFOLU sector. And now all the rest of that, so the 4/5 is all from basically fossil fuels. So it's all from anything having to do with industry, energy, fossil fuels, etc. But 22% of that, so that's a significant amount, is from the land sector, essentially, right? And so because these are from the land sector, it's clear that nature-based solutions can help reduce this trend, because of course, all of this, we need to reduce all of this to hopefully zero, right? Or net zero, right? So this 22%, we need to reduce it as much as possible. And so nature-based solutions, of course, can help reduce this 22% of greenhouse gases from the AFOLU sector. So again, doing all of those actions that we talked about. Conservation, so stopping deforestation, because of course deforestation is contributing to this 22%, right? But also sustainable management, because the unsustainable management, kind of industrial agriculture, is what's contributing very much so to this 22%, right? So by stopping deforestation and stopping kind of unsustainable management, unsustainable agricultural practices, that will reduce the 22%. In addition to this, nature-based solutions can also help to go beyond just reducing this 22% and possibly help with greenhouse gas removals, right? So I think probably in other parts of the course, you're talking about climate change, so we're talking about both reductions and removals. Those are kind of the two different sides of the coin, right? You need both. You need reductions and you need removals. And so removals can take place through for the reforestation, but we do need to be aware of overestimating this or of having an over-exaggeration of the potential for nature helping to remove, to suck down, to sequester greenhouse gases, because there has been some hype about nature being able to suck down all this carbon, and it's been, so we need to look at the science basically to actually see, okay, what is the realistic potential for this? So this is a paper published by Girardin et al. In 2021, estimating potential for the potential of nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation. And so what it found, doing a kind of synthesis of many different other papers that came before it, is that the maximum potential, so this is really, this is the kind of maximum if we do things really good, really right, with safeguards, however, so the maximized with safeguards potential of nature-based solutions are that it could save 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year in emissions. And so this is split 50-50, 5 gigatons on the one hand, avoiding emissions. So that's in the reduction side of things. So that's in that, again, that 22% avoiding emissions. So that's protecting land from deforestation, and also a little bit of sustainable management as well. And then on the other side, the other 5 gigatons, the other half, is that kind of enhancing sinks, is that kind of sequestering of CO2. So you have 2 gigatons out of that overall 10, so 20% of the overall potential of NBS comes from restoration. And so this is just important to note because, of course, restoration, is super important, super key. 20% is significant. We can do a lot, but it just shows that most of the emphasis should not be on restoration, that there's much higher potential. 80% of the potential comes from that protection. So again, stopping deforestation and stopping the destruction of ecosystems, and from that sustainable management. Still need restoration, but the other two are extremely important. So this is a summary of the findings from that same paper. So the first point is what I just summarized, is that it has a potential of 10 gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. And then the second part of the paper also found that nature-based solutions, when done right, have a potential to shave off between 0.1 to 0.3 degrees Celsius in warming in the 1.5 and 2 degree scenario respectively. So for instance, if we're on a 1.5 scenario, then it would shave off 0.1. If we're on a 2 degree scenario, it would shave off 0.3. Moreover, nature-based solutions are projected to keep cooling the planet after peak temperature has been reached, suppressing warming by up to 0.4 degrees by 2100. So these are incredibly important and significant numbers, because we know that every fraction of a degree, every 0.1 of a degree makes a huge difference, right? We can look back to those slides at the beginning, think back to those slides at the beginning, when we're showing the impact on biodiversity, on mammals, etc., compared to a 1.5 degree world and a 2 degree world. And then, that was just on biodiversity, but not to mention the impacts on human livelihoods are huge as well. Those analyses have also been done comparing a 1.5 and a 2 degree world. So each fraction of a degree really matters. And we will need to, of course, we're certain now that we will unfortunately be overshooting 1.5 degrees, and the question now is trying to minimize that overshoot as much as possible. So making sure that overshoot is as small as possible, and then by bringing the overshoot back down. So we still do have hope that despite the overshoot, we can then bring warming back down to 1.5. And so we see here that nature-based solutions have a really interesting, important potential to then bring peak temperature back down slowly after 2050, after we reach that peak temperature. So in summary, nature-based solutions have a real but limited impact on bringing down our peak warming by mid-century, and this is only if we decarbonize and if nature-based solutions are implemented properly. So again, these potentials are really based on modeling that it's like, if we do everything right, if we do things right as much as possible, where possible, right? And we also need to be aware that the capacity of land-based mitigation, so, when we're talking about nature-based solutions for climate mitigation, this is land-based mitigation versus like other kind of technological carbon storage is not land-based mitigation. The potential is finite, right? The potential is finite because we have finite land. There's huge competition for land, for food, for living, for biodiversity, for all these different kind of competing priorities. So potential is finite, and crucially, further warming compromises the performance and the potential of nature-based solutions for climate mitigation. So the more the world warms, the more, the less nature-based solutions will actually be able to provide these benefits, because they'll go up in smoke, because they will be less resilient to various different disturbances. And here we go. Here are the risks. So yeah, what are some of the risks to this potential? There are biophysical risks. So these can involve fire, and we know that that this has been a huge issue in recent years. Huge fires, many places in the world, and a lot of fires also affecting, nature-based solutions project that have been funded and monitored, and everyone's excited about the project, and then it goes up in smoke. Terrible. So that's a huge risk. But they can also, biophysical risk can also be pests, can also be drought and temperature stress, can also be storms, so like big wind events knocking down trees, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. And so what can help to mitigate these biophysical risks? Well, biodiversity can actually help. So increase biodiversity. The more biodiversity you have, the more resilient your system is. So biodiversity increasing and so supporting, enhancing the biodiversity in your system can actually help with resilience to these biophysical risks, whether it's fire, whether it's pest, whether it's drought, etc. And also interventions based on sound science can help mitigate these risks. So I think I briefly, I didn't see the whole question, but I think I saw at some point in the chat, maybe someone asking, I think it was, what species or what nature-based solutions were good for a particular area. Well, it's always going to be very, very place-based, and it needs to involve ecologists, biologists, all different types of scientists, climate scientists projecting what the future climate with climate change will be of that area. Will the planted species be able to survive not only the current climate, but the future climate in that area, but also using traditional ecological knowledge and working with indigenous peoples and the people who know the local ecosystems there, of what grows well there and why, and what will you don't want to plant any invasive species there. You don't want everything that you plant having a huge planting effort and then it all dying because of a drought. So right species, right place is really key, and there can be no blanket recommendations for this. It's very locally specific and very place-based. But science is really important in this case. So again, interventions based on that sound science, so that using that sound ecology and that climate science can also help to minimize these risks. Then on the kind of governance and human system side of risks, there is a risk of financial failure. There's risks of management failure. So for instance, you can have a perfectly planned project, but then maybe there is a law of illegal harvesting or illegal logging in the area coming in, and you don't have the enforcement in place to actually stop those illegal activities. You can have policy changes at a national level and international level, and you can have economic changes. And so, for example, as global food prices shift, as the prices of different commodities, such as critical minerals, shift, that can create really high and less high demand for various types of exploitation and extraction. So over the past decade, we've seen the price of gold absolutely soar to higher than ever levels. And this is causing huge problems in many areas around the world. I'm most familiar with it in the Amazon, where a lot of gold mining is really negatively affecting the ecosystems there. And so that is, of course, indirectly affected by the economic system and the stock market and the price of these commodities. And so for these governance risks, good governance can help to minimize these risks. And so for both of these, there is a really key role for people like you on this call to be working on these issues. So for the biophysical risks, there's a key role for natural science research to work on those climate scenarios, to work on that ecology. How can we minimize these risks? And there's a really key role for social scientists as well, working on governance of nature-based solutions, which is what I'm working on my PhD at the moment. And so in the previous slide, I said, oh, good governance can help with these risks. What is good governance? What does that look like? Of course, you can have lectures and lectures and papers on that, but some kind of broad principles about good governance is that it is participatory, inclusive, and equitable governance of NBS, of nature-based solutions, is key to ensuring the permanence of nature-based solutions and minimizing the risks to nature-based solutions potential. So local community buy-in and participation in the design, the implementation, and the monitoring is really crucial for the longevity and the success of the NBS project. We talk a lot about I can't remember the exact word, but basically the permanence of various NBS projects and how these things can be quite impermanent, again, because of the biophysical risk, but also if the local community if there's no buy-in, then they might just not implement it, not follow it, right? And again, pointing back to the importance of of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and recognizing the science and all the studies and evidence that the lowest rates of forest loss are found on Indigenous peoples' lands overall. And of course, this is a generalization, but in general, the evidence does point towards this. So land titling can be a really effective way of preventing forest loss. And we need to be clear that nature-based solutions are not a substitute for decarbonization and not an alternative to technological solutions. I know, throughout the rest of your course, again, you're going to be focusing a lot on climate change, talking about many different technological solutions, and we should definitely not be juxtaposing kind of nature-based solutions versus other solutions. We really need them all. So we must use technology to decarbonize the energy sector, to decarbonize things like aviation, like shipping, like industry, like transport. In these sectors, there's nothing really that nature-based solutions can do. It needs to be technological solutions, right? And we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And we need a combination for adaptation. We need a combination of engineered and nature-based solutions to adapt to climate change. So we can't just use NBS. And so moving on to nature-based solutions for adaptation. So nature can help us to adapt to climate change in multiple ways. And so these different kind of categories in these different ways, again, map on very closely to your responses in that Menti poll of various different ecosystem services, right? So a lot of that climate adaptation, that's what we're talking about here. So in terms of water, different nature-based solutions and nature in general can help with the regulation of water flows, which is, of course, going to be increasingly an issue with climate change. It can help with the reduction of floods and of soil erosion, again, made worse by climate change. Climate change also threatens food security. It also threatens the water and soil retention. So NBS can help us with that. Of course, we know that our cities are going to get scorching hot with climate change, and nature in cities can help with urban cooling. It can also help with flood protection in cities. It can help with clean water supply in cities. It can help with slope stabilization. And then also with stabilizing supply chains, which are at risk with both climate change and crucially biodiversity loss as well, very much putting supply chains at risk. Nature-based solutions can help with sustainable production, landscapes, and rural livelihoods, very much so with disaster risk management, and crucially with health. There are kind of big interlinkages between health and climate change worsening health outcomes. I saw someone kind of write something about pollution in the chat very briefly. So of course, reducing climate change, but also having green spaces in cities can help with pollution, can help with cooling, to reduce heat-related distress for health, and also with psychological well-being. And so from this, we've seen that nature-based solutions can bring multiple benefits, right? It can bring that carbon sequestration at the top, and then also, of course, that biodiversity conservation and that ecosystem protection, but then so many other multiple benefits, such as disaster risk reduction and sustainability across multiple sectors. And so this is really moving away from that dominant idea of carbon sequestration being that kind of primary or most important benefit, and biodiversity and others being kind of, side benefits, co-benefits, nice to have, towards really having nature-based solutions as kind of the initial project's goals to be multiple benefits and multiple contributions, or multiple nature contributions to people. And so because they can bring these multiple benefits, nature-based solutions can unite multilateral agreements, right? So we have here many different multilateral agreements. We have the UNFCCC, Convention on Climate Change, the CBD, one on biodiversity, but we also have the SDGs. We have that kind of third sister Rio Convention on desertification. There's also a convention on wetlands, and there's also one on disaster risk reduction. So so nature-based solutions can unite and be a tool. I hesitate to talk about nature as a tool because it's really people as nature working with nature, right? But if it's at all helpful, you can think about it as nature-based solutions as being an element that can be used as a solution throughout all of these different conventions. And so this has implications for also that I'm talking like on the international level, but also very much so at a national and subnational policy level as well. And so because all these things are interlinked, I want to encourage us all to think about integrated policymaking if we're thinking about policy. So the approach to policy making should be integrated, should be holistic, should be following kind of a whole of society and whole of government approach. And so we need to get away from policy made in just silos, and we need to consider the interactions between, again, going back to that first slide, that nexus assessment report, interactions between biodiversity, between nature, land, and human rights when we're thinking about these climate policy recommendations. And so throughout your other sessions, and thinking back on the sessions that you've had as part of the School of Climate Change, and the future sessions, I see this is week 2 only, I would like to encourage you to actively think about the interlinkages between the sessions, right? So between the sessions, between the topics, between the crises, and what synergies and crucially what trade-offs might there be between the different approaches that you're seeing presented to you across all the sessions, right? Lastly, I just have a couple of slides before finishing. I know I've not left quite enough time for questions, but of course there will be at least 15 minutes. So hopefully that'll be enough for questions. So I spoke about this earlier, and again, to remind people, so the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so IPBES. IPBES plays a similar role in the CBD, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, as the IPCC does to the UNFCCC. A lot of acronyms I know, but hopefully you've seen this earlier in the presentation when I presented that kind of comparison slide, right? So basically, IPBES is like that produces the scientific reports for the biodiversity, and the IPCC produces the scientific reports for the Convention on Climate Change, which has the COPs and the negotiations and all of that, right? So basically, they synthesize the scientific evidence on biodiversity loss. So they basically look at like all of the scientific papers that have been published by all scientists all around the world and look at the best ones and where there is agreement and what the evidence is really pointing to. Because of course, you have so many different papers, you might have kind of one outlier paper that maybe something about it was maybe, I don't know, wrong, or it just found a kind of weird like fluke. So it's pointing in a different direction, but it really looks at like the sum of the evidence of what all the evidence is pointing towards and synthesizes all the evidence into like these massive, really significant and really scientifically robust reports. And these are then used to inform the CBD at its COPs. And so the last two reports that came out, sorry, this is a little bit confusing because the three reports that I have down here are not the last two, but these three reports that you see in the images are really kind of great ones. So you have the biodiversity and ecosystem one, so that was the big kind of cornerstone one, but then also the diverse value ones, and then they had this workshop report on biodiversity and climate. These were a few years ago, but the last two reports that came out last year, so 2024, 2025, were the nexus assessment, that one that I mentioned in the first slide with all the interlinkages between those nexus elements, right? Climate, biodiversity, health, food, water. But then they also came out with another one that I would highly encourage you to check out, is the transformative change assessment as well. So those two came out last year, and they're really fantastic reports. So this is my last slide. And so I mentioned a couple times, and I think I've been told that your capstone, I'm not sure exactly how this works, but that your capstone project will be related to IPBES 12. And so I've prepared a slide on this. It's taking place next week. I'll be going next week to this. So obviously it's not taken place yet, so can't really tell you what the outcomes are yet. We don't know. But it's taking place next week in the UK, in Manchester. And it's kind of like a COP. It's basically like a conference for different parties to negotiate what's going to be contained in this report, because they're science policy bodies. So the countries actually have a say on what's emphasized and contained in these different reports. And so there is one report that is due to be, so it's a new report that's kind of almost done, that is due to be assessed, and it's due to be negotiated and approved next week. And this is the business and biodiversity assessment. And so the summary hasn't been put out yet. The summary will be only put out after the conference ends. So during the conference, people who are there will be able to see kind of drafts of the summary, negotiated, etc. And essentially this report is meant to provide robust evidence on how businesses can act to appropriately conserve and restore biodiversity, and how other stakeholders, for example, governments, but also NGOs, etc., can create an enabling environment for, again, these businesses to not harm biodiversity. And then it also encourages uptake of things like the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, which you might also be touching on in your capstone project, perhaps. And then also at the conference, there'll be different agenda items. So it might talk about future reports in collaboration with IPCC, so with climate, right? And then it'll also briefly discuss some upcoming assessments. So there's three upcoming assessments happening now. One is on monitoring biodiversity. The other one is on spatial planning of biodiversity. So these will come out next year, and then in 2 years from now, they'll have this kind of second big global assessment report that is due to come out. So all of that will be discussed next week, and then after the 9th, you'll be able to see some results from that. So that's it. Sorry for only leaving 12 minutes for questions. And I know that was a lot of information, really jam-packed in there. But yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen and really welcoming any questions and discussion. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Could we have a round of applause? Hopefully you could hear that through the mic, Audrey. I'll maybe offer a comment more than a question first. I liked your point a couple slides earlier. That was talking about how scientists are having to use climate projections to see what kinds of nature-based solutions are going to be most resilient in a future climate. And that was particularly interesting to me because my college actually went through this recently, and that they wanted to plant a new tree in our garden. And they'd use projections to look at what kind of tree will be resilient when it grows to maturity in about 15 to 20 years time. And so they actually chose like a Mediterranean style tree. which was really interesting to see that coming into practice, like here in Oxford as well. But yeah, I just thought I'd share that as a fun story and make it relevant for all of us. But are there any questions in the room to start off with? So the question in the room is, who is normally implementing nature-based solutions? Is it governments? Is it international organizations? Who are the people doing this?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So it can really be all sorts of different stakeholders. There are government-led projects, certainly. There are many international kind of big NGOs doing this internationally. There are many more local, smaller NGOs doing this at a more kind of local scale. There's lots of local communities doing it, even local communities in cities, in the UK, in your own countries, across the world, kind of different, activists planting different kind of urban gardens and stuff that would count, right? And then there's a lot of indigenous peoples as well who are implementing these nature-based solutions. They're probably not calling them nature-based solutions, right? So it can really be from any stakeholders. There are also private companies who are doing it, relating it often to carbon offsets, but it can also be private companies working on agroforestry projects. So yeah, it can really be any different stakeholder, or often it is collaborations of different stakeholders working together.
We might take a question from online next, just to keep it even. Sorry for the keen beans in the room. We got an online question just coming, sorry. So this one is asking you, Audrey, what are your personal views on the way that nature-based solutions help to make urban environments more resilient, such as a sponge city concept? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think many of these are fantastic initiatives, and I think it holds huge potential. And we definitely, especially for climate adaptation, right? Especially, of course, cities are globally a relatively small land area. But especially for climate adaptation, it's going to be hugely important. There's huge issue with droughts, sorry, not droughts. There's huge issue with flooding in cities. So things exactly like sponge cities can really, really help with flood and water management within cities. Huge problems with urban heat islands. So having green spaces and trees and shading can really help. Also with helping. One interesting kind of interlinkage is if we think of in terms of climate mitigation. There's been many kind of studies showing how trees shading buildings in the hot summer then reduces the need for air conditioning, which in turn reduces energy uses, which is, climate mitigation. Or even in the winter, if you have a wall of trees protecting, again, a building from a very strong, cold, icy wind, then the building may not need as much heating, again reducing energy usage. So it can also link to climate mitigation in that way as well, not only through the kind of sequestration through trees. But yeah, it definitely is hugely exciting and something that all cities should be considering, but they need to be planned right. Similarly to the kind of negative examples that we saw, all of those were in rural settings. When in urban settings, if the local communities and neighborhoods, the people who live there are not consulted and involved, it can result in negative social outcomes. And so the same principles need to be applied in urban settings as well.
Thank you so much. Is there another question in the room? Yeah. The question in the room is there a case study that comes to mind for you where both community and government involvement came to a really positive outcome?
Both community and government involvement came to what?
Came to like the positive outcome for the nature-based project. like achieved
Positive
its
outcome.
goals.
Yeah. Does it mean like, yeah, like a case study of like the two working together? So like a kind of like the like a government
Yeah,
like working
yeah,
with,
exactly.
yeah. I would say like so many come to mind because this is actually quite common, and some I would say I would go back to the first of those kind of three positive examples. So that's the one in Bolivia, because it basically involved land titling, right? So it was indigenous and local communities first of all advocating for their lands to be titled, but it was ultimately the government who then gave the land titles, right? So it was the government who allowed that to then happen, and then it was managed by the local community. So often you do see cases like that, and yeah, there are a lot of cases in general like that.
Great. Is there another question online we can take? This one asks, since there is a risk of greenwashing when companies that are actually harming biodiversity then use nature-based solutions to offset or obscure their impacts, how can the nature-based solution sector attract a broader and more diverse group of investors while maintaining its integrity?
Hmm. That is such a fantastic question because, yeah, exactly. That while maintaining its integrity. So there are several nature-based solutions projects, or indeed, organizations that even when offered money from sketchy actors like fossil fuel companies or other kind of very polluting sectors, will not take that money to maintain their integrity, right? Because they, a project could say, well, we don't want Shell to actually say that they're green because they've paid us some money, right? So that's one. But yeah, but your question was how can these projects attract other investment? That's a really tricky one. And there are a lot of really kind of interesting stuff on this. I think there needs to be a blend of public and private finance, and some types of activities are primarily kind of suited to public finance. So in particular, things like NBS for climate adaptation, um, not all the time. Like so for example, if you have stuff relating to water or drought, then there can be cases where private water companies can actually invest, and there can be really positive private-public partnerships with water companies. But in other cases, protecting kind of citizens from climate disaster is a public good that governments have the responsibility to provide, and that it may not be appropriate for investors to get a return on investment. Um, so yeah, but people are talking about kind of having pipelines of investable NBS projects to have them like be higher profile for investors to pay attention to them, or even like grouping smaller projects together so that kind of bigger investors can put a bunch of money that would go to a bunch of different projects in a portfolio. So there's several different ways, but it is a tricky issue for sure.
So much. We probably have time for one more question from the audience. This one is asking specifically about the European Union's restoration law and how effective that's been over its duration.
Oof. I mean, I've heard of it, but I wouldn't be able to speak about how effective it's been. I'm sorry. I don't have enough I don't have enough background on that. Should we take another? Can we fit in another question?
We'll do one more different last question. There was one. So this one's asking about, Audrey, what your personal opinions would be around the movement of giving the environment and nature, or bodies within nature, individual rights as part of protections for them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's where I thought the question was going when you were first mentioning it. Yeah, I think this is a really an idea that has a lot of potential, a lot of fantastic potential because it can be used legally to protect places. And there have been instances where various different places that were at risk of development, whether it was mining, fossil fuel extraction, different extractive activities, because they had rights. So like through legislation nationally, they were then protected. These things are complicated. There can be various different kind of some downsides potentially, but that, yeah, we're over time, so we don't have time to discuss. But I think overall, it's a really important legal tool that we can really use to our benefit for biodiversity protection.
Thank you so much for that answer. And maybe as a response as well from us, the team, we'll be having a specialist in climate change and the law in a couple of weeks' time with Rupert Stewart-Smith. So maybe save that question and put it to him as well and see what answer he gives. Could we have one more round of applause for Audrey? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, sorry for not leaving that much time for questions and being quite long-winded in my responses. But yeah, thank you all very much.
And thank you so much for your time and all the insights that you shared. A
My
quick
pleasure.
notice from us. Next week, we have Alexis McGibbon and Rosalind coming to talk about climate change and activism, so top-down and bottom-up approaches to that. It's going to be a really exciting session, so do come. And we are moving the social to week 4. So in the participant handbook, it might be down as week 3, but the social for in-person participants is going to be in week 4, so that we have time to allocate you all your capstone groups. And Audrey hinted to the topic of those, but there'll be more resources coming out on that very soon. So thank you very much for coming, and see you all next week.